Go ahead.
Hello, I'm Rachel Riedner again, and I'm here to introduce my colleague and friend Kathryn Kleppinger, who is Assistant Professor of French and Francophone Studies, and the most recent winner of our WID Distinguished Teaching Award for Excellence in Teaching of Writing at GW. And so we're very proud to have her.
Thank you.
And she's going to work us through some work, assignments that she does with students in her classroom. And then when she's done, I'll pop back in and we can chat.
Sounds great. Thank you, Rachel, for inviting me. I'm looking forward to talking. So what I've done today is I prepared just a few slides to tell you a little bit both about the students that I work with and then how I use French literature to teach them about writing and analysis. So we can move to the first one. So because I'm teaching in a French language setting, it's important to keep in mind a few basic details about the students. In that they already have a basic proficiency of French. So either they come in with strong language skills from high school, or they've already taken some of our previous language courses at the university. So that means that, in theory at least, they should know how to write with most verb tenses, have a basic vocabulary, and they're comfortable doing all of their reading and writing in the French language. I find that in practice they still struggle with some more complex sentences, so I do, while it is primarily what we would call a content class where we're reading and discussing the material, we also do a little bit of work on the language at the same time. And so what I do to help them, we can move forward. What I do to help them as they move forward is that I have a few basic goals I want to accomplish. So to give you just an idea of what that is, I try to convince students that writing in itself is not necessarily the end product, but that it is part of the process to get to this end product. And I find that students often misunderstand this. They think that writing a final paper is kind of the be-all and end-all of the project, when what I try to convince them of is that writing is something we do all the way through. So writing is not just the ends, but also the means to the end, and that to get to this point, clear thinking and clear writing are actually dependent upon each other. That when writing is not clear, it's usually an indication that the thinking is not clear, and that when the thinking's not clear, it's impossible to write clearly, so that you really need to have both going on at the same time. I also want to make sure that students understand that while yes, my course is about French literature and writing about French literature, it's not actually meant to only train them in French literature. So the skills are designed to be transferable, that just even analyzing texts or documents of any type and writing and expressing thoughts clearly about them is also part of the training that can happen in any language, any context, any job they might be doing down the road. So in the end, what I try to convince them of is that really everything about professional life comes back to being a nuanced thinker and then also being able to communicate those ideas in a both written and oral format. So we have several different overarching approaches that I try to employ to get them to this point. And I try to do it in a step-by-step way where we build up from the ground up, really. And so each step is supposed to be logical and motivated as much as possible. And by that I mean we start by analyzing very, very small excerpts. I mean, we're talking about sentences and words. Move from there to looking at themes present in texts, and then moving beyond that to create an argument about these themes. So it's very much a constructive approach, and I accomplish this with a mix of in-class and at-home assignments. So some of this they prepare at home, some of this we do in class together. And I make it as collaborative as I can. So students often prepare some basic ideas at home, and then they come together in class to work on the arguments, and then I help with that sort of thought process. So I brought in a few examples of some assignments, if you'd like to forward along. This is an example of a homework assignment, and so I ended up including, everything is in French, but I included all the translations for you. And this comes from a poem by Joachim du Bellay, a Renaissance poet, and the poem is called Heureux qui comme Ulysse, and it's a poem about homecoming after a long travel. And so what I start by having them do, these are the 4 questions of the homework, and they're expected to write a short paragraph for each one. So the first question asks them to do just a brief summary of each verse. And I use that as a beginning step in order to make sure they understand what the message of the poem actually is. So I ask them to identify the main ideas and also to justify that with concrete examples. So what are the main ideas presented in each verse and how did you come to that conclusion? The next thing I do is have them analyze the structure of the poem. And we would have already in class discussed how to do this. So they'll be looking at the different types of convergences of words, what words are put in relationship with each other. Often this is via rhyme, so I ask them to look at the different types of rhymes, whether they're crossed rhymes or parallel rhymes, all the different types of rhyming. And then to actually use that structure and take just one specific verse and analyze the words that are put together. So this is becoming a little more focused. We're kind of telescoping in as they look at one very specific example. And of course they can choose different ones. That's the goal, is for them to pick one that they like. The next one is about looking at sort of the direction or the movement of the poem, in the sense that it actually does have a very specific direction it's moving in, and how you might break it up into parts. And what I like about this question is that there are different answers. And you can justify different ways of breaking it up, and students do. And that's great, because I can show them how there are different ways of reading the poem, different ways of analyzing it, and all of them are defensible. And so we usually use this as a way to get into the kind of nitty-gritty details of how the poem is structured, but how you can also interpret that in different ways. And so then finally I try to get them to telescope back out by thinking about, what is the kind of overarching main idea of the poem, and how can we determine this? So this is an at-home assignment, and when students come in, presumably they've answered these questions, and this is the class where I introduce what in French is called an explication de texte, or a close reading analysis. So what we would then do in class is use this as our starting point and construct a close analysis of some various different parts of the poem that students would have already prepared. So this is where an at-home assignment would actually feed into an in-class one, and they would be working in groups. So it is a collaborative endeavor. The next one is an in-class assignment. And this one I decided to do a little differently. This one comes from Voltaire's Candide. So now we have an example from a novel. And it comes from a really important passage in chapter 19. And it's when Candide has a conversation with a slave. And so what I'm trying to do is, this part is really central to the text in terms of understanding Voltaire's arguments in a lot of ways. So in class, they're working in groups, and first they need to just understand, what is the background of this slave? How did the slave get to this point? So again, a fairly direct, plot-driven understanding the point. But then we move very quickly, and one of the examples I find here, so the question is what style? And he has a very sort of melancholic, there's a lot of sadness in this because the slave has suffered. So there's, I ask students to identify what we call in French des champs lexicaux, or like word fields of themes in terms of how the words contribute to main moods or emotions. And so here we see it's very, very focused on suffering. And as students look at this, they see all sorts of examples of that. And of course, from that, with the suffering, we can see that there are a lot of different social critiques contained in the text about slavery. One example is that the slave makes a comment about, it's because of me that you have chocolate. And so that's an example of a social critique of how European society is only capable of being maintained thanks to this form of exploitation and domination. So we see that that is actually contained in it, even if it's not 100% clearly expressed. But the idea is going from one step to the next. And then, of course, Voltaire is also trying to educate the reader, and he does that through Candide's reaction. So then we look at how Candide responds to this story, to understand not only what the critiques are, but then what the reader is expected to take away from these critiques. And I have one final question actually on the next slide. I didn't want to make it too small. And the final one is that I also make them think in a broader terms, in that this is one of the first examples in a French text where the slave is speaking for himself, rather than having the author speak in his place. So Voltaire gives him a voice, and I try to get the students to think also about why this is important, that the slave is speaking directly. So I see this question is actually opening up even broader to think about literary genre and how authors are using characters, but also different types of themes. So I'm trying to get students to start by looking really, really narrowly, and then to build out, to think more broadly about what Voltaire is doing in this passage. We can move forward to here, and so continuing with this Voltaire theme, I also created an example of a assignment I do to help them move from this analysis of texts to the paper assignments. And I didn't think it was necessary to put all the translations here, but the way I do this assignment is that, so each one of these questions here, I have 5 different questions, one about satire, one about the different gardens, one about religious tolerance, one about women, and one about kind of Candide's development. And I print these out on a piece of paper, and I circle a number on each one. So I go through and just by hand quickly do it. I have about 19 students per class. And so I pass out the sheets, and each student gets a sheet with one of them circled. And that way, at home that night, I ask them to write one paragraph in which they present an argument, and we would have talked about how an argument is formed, and 3 examples to support that specific argument about whichever question they had been assigned. And then in class, we come together and students are put in groups according to the question they answered. And then we talk about how to structure a paper around this idea. So they discuss how to bring their arguments together. They understand this way that there are different arguments available based on each theme and different examples as well. And what I really like about this assignment actually is that it was designed, I came up with it actually in response to what I might call a challenge, in that it's often seen as complicated to teach both the nuts and bolts mechanics of writing and to cover what we might call content or material at the same time. And this assignment, I think, is perfect for accomplishing both goals, because what we end up doing in the class is actually discussing all of these questions. You know, what does satire do? What are these gardens? We get really into the meat of it, but we do it in the context of writing a paper. And so I feel like at the end of this session, we've accomplished something very concrete in actually 2 domains, where students understand the text better, but they also understand how to write. So it doesn't feel like the writing component is like taking away by any standard from the other analysis work, where I feel like it really gets at the heart of what we're trying to do in both the writing and in the material. So I just have a few more, just a quick one other thing just to give you a few more ideas. I have a few additional activities. I do a lot of graded and also ungraded close readings of passages throughout the semester. I decided after my first semester to start grading several of them because it was a good way to get students to pay attention to my feedback. But I don't grade them all, so I do it as a way to provide constant mechanisms. We do at least one a week, and I grade about once every 2 weeks. And I definitely try to privilege improvement, but I do it in order to force students to actually read my comments and to think about what they're doing. So collaborative explorations and presentations of themes. Sometimes I will just, at the end of a book, I will stand up and say, okay, let's identify the main themes, and we go through a bunch. And then I just divide students in pairs or groups of 3, depending on the numbers, and have each group prepare some sort of presentation or argument about the themes. And that way they come back together in class and go through them. So again, it's a way of developing arguments. We always do peer reviews of essays. And that way we do an entire session with very specific questions about how does the introduction work, are the examples logical, a little bit of the French as well. And that way students really exchange ideas about their topics. I try, if possible, to group students together based on similarities of themes, so I understand what they're writing about first, and that way they're really engaged with the same material. And I also ask them to do multiple drafts, and I always give feedback on at least one draft, and if students are interested in getting more feedback, then that's also great too. In terms of my grading, so the next one gives you a bit, next one, I guess I'll get back to grading in a second. One other part of assignments that I want students to think about is also the difference between primary and secondary sources. And so this is a sample of an assignment that we do in a unit on understanding secondary sources. These activities are a little different because it's about interpreting an already interpretive text. This one comes from an essay that we read. We've already read at this point Victor Hugo's Last Day of a Condemned Man, so this is an article about that. So they've already read the book, they're very knowledgeable about what's contained in the book, and then they look at an essay interpreting it. So I have them start by looking at the first paragraph, establishing the argument, how the author gets to this argument, and then moving forward, because the author actually brings in some difficulties of critique, all sorts of difficulties that come up when analyzing this material. So then he presents, kind of the problems and how he solved them. And then he moves into sources. And so I ask students to identify the types of sources. The first one is a reference to a kind of criminal theory text and a series of criminal theory texts. So my goal here is to get students to say, okay, this is one type of primary source that the author is relying on. And there are 2 other types. If we move on, I have a few more questions. He changes sources again to look at media, journals, newspapers, and then moving on to Victor Hugo's letters. And so I get them to understand that there's actually sort of a triangulation of 3 different primary sources, and that the author is using them in different ways, and that's the goal. So that then when we get to the end, we can understand how the author makes an argument about what Victor Hugo is doing in the book and how he supports it. And that way they can really understand how this argument is constructed. And I use this essay because, first of all, it's a really great one, but also because it gives students a very solid understanding of how to construct a very effective essay. So we use this not only as a way to understand more about Victor Hugo's text, but also how to construct a solid argument based on a variety of sources. And so I think it's my final slide. In terms of my grading structure, once we've been through all of this, I grade on content by 75% and style 25%. And I decided to go with this approach where students, I tell them, this is a spelling error, this is a conjugation error, this is a verb tense error, without telling them how to fix it. And that way students are forced to think about, okay, well, it's wrong, but what's right? And I find that that works really well because students are forced to address their own mistakes and learn about how to fix them. And I also try to emphasize the point that just as your writing in French can become clearer because you can improve your grammar and your style, it can also become clearer as you refine your ideas, and so that it's always a work in progress. So I actually find that even though the French can sometimes be a challenge because students are not necessarily as fluent as they are in English or even another language, it actually helps me prove my point easily that you can always get better and you can use this as a drafting opportunity. My other innovation that I've been really happy with is that, so I provide my feedback for the grammar, just writing it. I use a PDF file on my iPad, and then I use an app called Viddle that allows me to record the screen on my iPad, and then I can talk through the paper. So students receive video feedback from me where they don't see my face, they just hear my voice, and what they see is their paper on the screen. And I can use a stylus to make some markings as I go, and that allows me to provide very kind of real-time responses, but also I can flip among pages to say, okay, this part doesn't quite work here, but you're tying it back to here, or I see a contradiction between this idea and that idea. It allows me to be a little more dynamic and engaged. And I'm finding, I pioneered this about 2 years ago, and I'm finding that students both respond better to it because maybe it's because it's novel and it's something different, but they seem to like it. And also they've said that they understand my comments better, and I think it's because I can say more in a brief amount of time. I also find, surprisingly, I think that it's a time saver in and of itself, because I spend a little less time agonizing over how exactly to phrase things in a written format, since you try to avoid sounding too harsh, but you want to be honest and all those things. But I think that comes off in tone of voice pretty effectively. And so I actually find that my average video for a really strong paper is around 4 minutes, and for a weaker paper can be 8 or 9 minutes. But that in the end, that's still less time than I would spend writing a bunch of comments. So I think it both helps me with my grading, but also allows me to be a lot more efficient, effective, and create better drafts for students afterwards. So that's my overall structure. Rachel, I don't know if
I'm going to come back in. Thank you. Thank you so much, Kathryn. That was terrific. So I have a couple questions.
Sure.
And the first one is, 10 years ago, when I started teaching in the writing program, actually it was longer than that, but that's another story. A lot of faculty, when I spoke to them about the teaching of writing, they said, well, you're correcting grammar, aren't you? And in the writing program, I said, and my colleagues would say, actually, no, we spend some time on grammar, but our primary focus is not on the grammar itself. It's on the relationship between the content and the writing and the way that you discuss. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that a little bit more, and maybe I could pose it to you as a hypothetical question, which would be, if someone said to you, do you spend all your time commenting on student grammar and fixing their errors? Why don't you do that?
I mean, I don't do it for many reasons. First of all, which is that I think the best way to learn a language is to continue to use it. Mm-hmm. And so continuing to make mistakes, but then learn about what those mistakes are can certainly help. The other thing that I try to do is push them to expand their vocabulary, so that it's easy to say something is good, bad, boring, interesting, all of those kind of empty words.
Mm-hmm.
And students often use that as a fallback in French in particular because that's the vocabulary they have. But pushing them to work with a broader range of vocabulary not only forces them to go to the dictionary and look them up, but also learn to use them. So I think continuing to put the writing into practice is a way to learn the language without sitting there and filling in blanks of verb tenses. So I tell my students right from the start that this is not a language class, that what matters is the effective communication of ideas. And of course, bad grammar will lead to ineffective communication of ideas, which is why I insist on 25% style. That is still important, and I expect students to pay attention. And I do take points off if I see what I call kind of, and in French they call it, instead of calling it kind of stupid mistakes, they call it faute d'inattention, so like inattention mistakes. And I tell them that that's not okay. You need to pay attention to the basics. So I do emphasize some of that. But I actually argue that the better way to learn language is to continue to use it, and in the end they come out with a stronger understanding of the language while doing all of this.
That's great, because I would say that about English as well.
Yeah.
I would say that part of what you do when you write is you develop new ways of thinking and new vocabularies and new critical approaches, and so that the grammar, of course, is important, and that's a foundation, but what you're doing all the time is pushing at the way in which you use the language yourself. And sometimes when students are writing in English, their grammar will break down when they're dealing with a new and difficult concept,
right,
because the grammar isn't keeping up with the ideas. And for me, that's okay. That's what the drafting process allows us to address, is that
Exactly.
you work through drafts and you use the drafts to develop a complicated idea. Then if the grammar breaks down there, fine, you work through the idea, and then you can go back and edit.
And I always tell my students I would rather see an ambitious sentence that tries to really get at the meat of things that might mess up some advanced things like the subjunctive tense or something like that, than a simplified sentence that might be right but is really boring. And so I would rather see the ambition of making the effort to improve than to see someone kind of sitting in where it's safe.
Thank you so very much.
Thank
That
you.
was terrific. Thank you.